And so if we do dot length on this array, we're going to get 7 things. And what we remember is, when we count individual items to get a length, we start at 1. But when we use indexes, we start at 0. So the last index of our array is always going to be 1 less than the length of the array. So take a look. Powers of 2 array, it has 2, 4, 8, 16, etc. We can get the last index of this array and any array by getting the powers of the dot length and subtracting 1 from it. Right? So that's the last index, because remember we started at 0. Then after that, we're just going to count up. We would normally. And so the last index is always going to be 1 less than the length. So if we want to get the last item in an array, we can and then use the last index to access the last item on this array. So here, this is 7 items. We'll have 7 minus 1 is 6. So last index will be 6. So here we're doing at index 6, which is 128. Okay. So the last value in this array, this variable here, will be 128. Any questions about that? So something else we can do, and this is kind of something I didn't show last class, but it's possible. So we can have, like I said, we can have anything in an array, any type in an array. We've seen strings, numbers, Booleans in arrays. Well, you can also have arrays in arrays. Arrayception, as it's known. I'm just kidding. And so here, if we look at the thing at index 0, that's a number. That's the number 1. Okay. If we look at the thing at index 1, well, that's the string hello, right? If we look at the thing at index 2, that is another array, or a nested array, an array inside of an array. So if that's an array, we can access the thing with using another set of square brackets. And so what we're saying here is get this array, and then get the first thing inside of that array. In this case is string foo. Okay. That array could have an array inside of it. And you could keep going like that forever and ever. But, I wouldn't advise that you do. All right, so any questions about this? Okay? You might be asking array inside of an array. Well, one potential situation is maybe you're modeling like coordinates, right? And each thing in this array is an x and a y coordinate. So the first thing might be the x, and the second thing might be the y. And so each item in the array might be another array with 2 things in it. Just one possibility. Moving on to loops. All right, so we talked about loops, and in particular, we talked about 2 types of loops. The first of which being sort of the hallmark type of loop. And this is the for loop. Okay, and this is what it looks like. This is a method of repeating code in a way that doesn't require us to write it over and over. Okay, and so what this is saying is before the loop starts, do this first part, create this variable I, and set it equal to 0. Assign it to value 0. That's before the loop starts. Then, after each iteration of the loop, increment that value of I by 1. Increment, add 1. Remember, this is a shorthand for I equals I plus 1. And we're going to continue doing that as long as I is less than or equal to 10. Okay, so here, we're basically counting from 0 to 10. And here's what that looks like in a visual way. Right, so up here in the left-hand corner. And here is what's going to look like to our computer that's running this program. So before we start, we're going to get this variable I and set it equal to 0. And then we jump into the loop. We're going to console log I, because that's what's the code inside of there. And then remember, after each iteration, plus. And then we're going to check, is I less than? If it's true, keep going. Loop through this cycle until this is false, and then we'll stop. Okay, so once I is not less than or equal to 10, for instance, I is 11, then we're going to stop. Any questions about that? So far we've been using loops strictly to count up, right, in increments of 1. So we're going 0, 1, 2, 3 generally. And that's probably the most, the use case we'll use most of the time. However, that's not all we can do with for loops. We could also count down. So here, the first thing we're doing is creating a variable I and setting equal to 10. And after each iteration, rather than incrementing by 1, we're decrementing, subtracting 1 from I each time we loop through. And we're going to keep doing that until we get to I is not greater than 0. So once I is 0, it's no longer greater than 0. We'll stop. We can also do more interesting things like this. Take a second to look at this, and then somebody tell me, what is this loop doing? Give me a couple seconds to digest. Okay.
Is it counted by 2s?
Exactly. Right? It's counting by 2. What's the first thing it'll say in the log?
0.
Mm-hmm. And what's the second thing it'll say in the log? 4. 2, exactly. And so on and so forth. 4, 6, even numbers, right? Because what's happening here is we're starting at 0. After each iteration, we're saying I is equal I plus 2. So in this case, 0 plus 2 is 2. And then we're going to keep doing that until we get to I is equal to 20. Right? So as long as I is less than or equal to 20, keep going. So we can do all kinds of stuff with for loops, not just the simple counting up that we've been doing so far. However, the simple counting up is the thing we'll do most. The most common use case for a loop is to iterate through an array. Go and operate on each item in an array and do something with it. We'll see several examples of that tonight. The second type of loop we talked about is a while loop. Just somewhat simpler than a for loop. And all this loop says is, as this is true, to repeat what the loop races. So as long as this condition here is true, so as long as x is not equal to 0 in this case, as long as x is not equal to 0, repeat this code, whatever it is. Just keep repeating it. As long as that condition is true. And as soon as that condition is false, go on to the next thing. Okay, so here's what that looks like visualized. So here we start by asking this question: is I less than or equal to 0? I mean 10. And if it is, if it's true, if this is true, then we'll run code and we'll ask it again. We'll run the code, ask it again, and we'll keep doing that until the answer is false, and then we'll stop and continue going to the next step. You can see there's a loop going on here. Okay. So we also talked about, anything that we can do with the for loop, we could technically also do with the, right? So here we can deconstruct this for loop that we had counting to 20 by 2s, right? So 0, 4, 6, 8. we can construct that as a while loop by doing it like this, right? So we'll take this thing that happens before the loop and just put it before the loop. We can then do this at the end of each iteration, right? So this is the last thing in the loop. We can do this part. And then finally, each time, is this thing still true? So this is exactly equivalent to that. All right. Any questions about that? Everybody feeling good? Feeling great? Cool. All right, so what about this? Take a look at it. Infinite loop, I always say it's an infinite loop, right? Because true is always going to be true. True will never not be true. Because that is what it is. It's like an identity, right? True is true. And thus, we're going to be repeating this code forever and ever and ever and ever until somebody kills the program or our computer dies or whatever the case may be. All right, so this is what we call an infinite loop. And this is one thing, as programmers, we're always trying to avoid common bug that kind of crop up in our code. And you'll know it when it happens because your Chrome tab will freeze up and it'll just lock up. And then maybe eventually it'll show a little image and say, oh snap, something went wrong, something like that. So you'll know it when it happens. How do you prevent from doing that? Well, I mean, I write infinite loops occasionally. It happens. Like code is complicated, we make mistakes. And when it happens, your browser tab dies, and you're like, well, that's probably an infinite loop. Right? There's only a few bugs that are going to cause that. And the most common one is an infinite loop. And so you go look at your loops and say, where did it happen? And actually, Chrome is really good. In the console, it'll even say, infinite loop detected or something like that, and it'll point to the right place in the code. All right, so any other questions about loops? Thing that some people did ask is, like, what are these used for in real life, right? So loops in general, this is not something that's unique to JavaScript. Loops predate JavaScript by decades, right? They're part of C and early languages like that. So they have all kinds of applications and different problems. When it comes to the web, in my mind, these are the two most common use cases for a loop. Okay, one is, maybe we have a list or an array of DOM elements. Okay, so in other words, maybe we have a list of paragraphs that are on our page. Maybe we want to iterate over that list of paragraphs and do something to each of them. Okay. So for instance, maybe we want to get all of the paragraphs on the page and make them blue, right? So in this class so far, what we would have done is just use jQuery, which is a perfectly good solution. But if we didn't have jQuery, the only way to do that would be to loop through those elements and change them once. Okay? And I'll actually show you what that looks like in a second. The other thing is something that we started last class and didn't finish, and we'll do it a couple times tonight. But sometimes, oftentimes we write our HTML ahead of time, right, and just put our pages there. Sometimes our HTML is not written ahead of time; it's generated by JavaScript, and we can use a for loop to generate repetitive HTML. For instance, list items or drop-down options, as we'll see later. Things of that nature, we can use loops to generate that HTML rather than handwriting it all and make it, that's cumbersome. Yes?
Would Facebook be like an example of maybe using a loop to pull our information into a loop?
Would Facebook be?
Well, how there's billions of users out there.
Yeah.
All that data being stored, and how do they know everything?
Yeah, I mean, so a website like Facebook is something we might refer to as like a web application, right? So when the Facebook page loads, there's nothing there. They don't pre-write any of that HTML. JavaScript is is creating all of that HTML. Okay, so everything you see on Facebook.com or like Gmail.com or any of these sites is 90% of the time is going to be mostly generated by JavaScript. Okay, and so yeah, if you have like say a list of newsfeed items, right, on your Facebook feed, you might use a loop, go through that list of Facebook news item things, and then show them in the so yeah, totally good example. And to this, so somebody gave me like a website, any website. What's your favorite website? No? All right, well, I'm going to pick one. What? SpaceX. Yeah, I could do that. Let's just do the, let's just do those. I don't know if this is going to be a good example or not, but we're just going to do it. So what I want to show you is how jQuery works underneath the hood in a very simplistic way. Okay, follow along if you want. Or you can just kind of watch and see what I do here. It'll probably be more beneficial for you to just watch because this isn't something you'll be doing since we're going to be using jQuery, but it's something that you could do. Okay, so yeah, this may not have been a great choice because they spell all kinds of stuff into the console. But we'll see if we can keep it clean. Okay, so here we are on the Washington Post. And we know that this site has a ton of stuff. It has some links. Okay. And we can see there's some links up here. Probably the navigational links. I would assume those are links. And so what we learned in the first JavaScript class is how to get those things using vanilla JavaScript. Okay? So here what I'm going to do, I'm going to create a variable called links. And in that, I'm going to do document get elements by tag name. And this is a function that looks for things on the page that have some tag name. In this case, I'm going to use A for the anchor tag, then as an array. Okay, so check this out. I'm going to put in A. Right? And now if I look at my links, okay, well, it's a big long array, but I can see that each of these things, and even when I hover over them, you kind of see where they are on the page, right? So each of these things is a tag on this page, and there's a ton of them. There's 466 on this page. Okay, so if I wanted to, say, turn all of those links blue, right? If I don't have jQuery to use, I could do something like a for loop. So I could say for var I equals start at 0, and I want to continue until I is less than, while I continue while I is less than links.length. Okay, we use strictly less than, not less than or equal to, because the length one more than the last index. So we want to strictly less than the situation. Okay, and then I want to each time increment I by 1, so I can look at every link in this list. Yeah, I think I can. Yeah. Oh, I don't know if my font's big enough. I'll make it a little bigger. And then for each one of these things, I want to get the link out of there. So I'm going to say, well, var link is equal to links at index I, right? Because I is going to be the thing that's counting up as we go. So I've got the link I'm looking for, and I'm going to change that link's color to blue. Okay, and so this is how you do this in vanilla JavaScript. Normally, again, we're doing this using jQuery. It looks a little bit different. Oh, thank you. Looking out. And so now I can run this, and it's going to take this whole long list of links, and for each one, it's going to go in there and change the inline style to add a color of blue. Okay, so fingers crossed because I just picked a random site, but all the links turn blue. See this? All of them are blue now. Right? So that, underneath it all, is how jQuery is working. Right? So we've been kind of shielded from all these arrays because we're using this awesome, powerful tool called jQuery in order to kind of abstract these things away from us. But underneath it all, jQuery is doing just this. It's getting all of the elements, the selector that we're looking for, and it's iterating through them and doing whatever task we're asking it to do. Okay, so this is the practical use of arrays and loops on web pages. Right? It's collecting DOM elements and then operating on them in some way. Yeah. So I mentioned this when we first introduced jQuery. There are a couple situations when you wouldn't want to. The most obvious of which is jQuery is a large library. It's big in size, right? So big in kilobytes that we would use. And if we are concerned about the size of the library, then we might not use jQuery because we can accomplish things that jQuery does with the heft of the library. For instance, the product that I work on is a set of, like sharing button tools and various things that are on like 15 million websites, right? And so they use our tools as opposed to the tens of others that exist is because ours load fast. And the reason that they load fast is because we don't use libraries like jQuery to do stuff like this. We have to be as slim as possible and size down of our library. With that, just use this. Now, most of the sites that you'll work on, it's going to be totally fine. Another reason why you might not do it is you might be using a JavaScript framework that has solutions to these things that are not jQuery. So, for instance, there's a very popular JavaScript framework right now called React, right? And it's book, as a matter of fact, and that library does all of the HTML manipulation on its own. So you don't have to do it directly, and in fact, anti-pattern to use both jQuery and React at the same time. So those are a couple situations why you might not. The other final thing I'll add there is, modern browsers, the newest of browsers, have solutions for much of the things that jQuery does that don't require you to use jQuery. Like, the one really great thing about jQuery is it's backwards compatible to early IEs. IE 7 maybe, it's 8, right? I don't know, whatever it is. So it potentially can support backwards further. If my only goal is Chrome, then I might not need jQuery. Cool. Any other questions? Okay, so back into the exercise that we started at the end of. Actually, should we just take an early break and get into how are you feeling? Early break? I shouldn't get a vote on that. Let's just do an early break, and then we'll come back and get started on the exercise right after that, because I don't want to stop in the middle of that.
Sarah, I don't think Sarah's been as long. So it's like nice. It's just so cool. Oh, is that just planetarium?
Okay, so we're gonna go back to the planetarium website. Sorry, last class. However, even if you started last class, I would like you to use the starter code. This class is exactly where we left off last class, but I added some stuff because we're gonna be working in this all night. So we're gonna be adding stuff to this all night. So if you would open GitHub Desktop and go ahead and make sure you're getting the latest. And once you've sunk, go ahead and open it in Finder. And in week 19, there's a starter code. Go ahead and copy that. Then in your named repository, just go ahead and make a new folder. Class 17. Paste in that new starter code. So again, this is exactly what we started last class. Exactly where we left off, but there's new stuff in there that we're going to be looking at later tonight. So go ahead and drag this planetarium loops to Sublime Text. All right. Everybody with us? a reminder as to what this website is. Well, I can just open it and take a peek. Remember, this is just like a website, and it has this image of a planet, and we can then go to the next planet, the next planet, the next planet, and go previous, kind of go through this carousel-like experience here. So generally, we call this user interface component carousel. So it's like a list of images that we can, page through. We'll see these all over the place online. Some of them, automatically scroll or whatever it may be, but ours is like this. So this is what we're working on. All right, so let's take a look. So if we're looking at the HTML, we can see, here is our area. Here's the area that we're going to reach every time that next button's hit. So right here we have the image itself, and we have H2 that has title of the image just below it. So this is the part that needs to change every time we hit that next or previous button. All right, so let's take a look at our code and see how far we got last time. Notice there's a new JavaScript file in the register, but we're still going to be working in index.js. So here's what we got so far. So, once our document is ready, we're going to start running this program. The first thing we do is we just create an array of planets, planet names specifically. So here we've created this variable, planets, and in there we have this array or list of planet names. And each of those planet names is just a string that has that planet's name. And we formatted it like this because, if we hadn't, we would have one really long line, and this is a bit prettier, but it's the same thing. Okay? So we started on the second step, which is we wanted to create a function that takes in as input a planet's name and returns as output HTML. Specifically, the HTML that we want to be changing, HTML that we want to change each time we hit the button. Okay? So we're creating this bit of HTML here. So the image and the H2. So we started on that, and the first thing we did is we created this image HTML variable. And in that variable, we put 3 strings concatenated together, smushed together, right? So this first string here is the first half of the image tag. Okay. Then, after the planet's name, but we're going to make that planet lowercase because the files have lowercase names. So for instance, if that planet name is Mercury, see that the Mercury file has a lowercase name. So we're going to want to make sure the case matches here. Okay? And then after that, we're putting the end part of the image tag. Okay? And then these 3 things get smushed together into one string, which represents our image tag, HTML. Okay? So this is that second use case that I talked about when I talked about what are loops used for. Well, creating HTML, looping through here, names of planets, other places made different things, and based on those things, creating some HTML that we can add to our page. Okay, so we've made our image HTML. The next thing we need to do is make some an H2 HTML. Remember that HTML that we're generating, that dynamic HTML, has 2 parts. It's the image and then also the H2. So we're going to do a similar thing that we did for the image for the H2. We're going to create a string here that has the opening H2 tag. And in between the opening and closed HTML tag, when its name. So our name input value. after that, what do we want to put after the planet's name? We want to put the in tag here, right? The close tag. Yes.
I have a question. How can you use planet name versus planets?
Right, because what we're doing here is we're just defining a generic function. Okay, so we're defining a generic function that takes as input a string and its name. Okay, planets of strings. Okay, that's not what we want here. We're creating a definition right now is completely independent of that array up there. Completely independent. All we're doing is creating a very generic function. A planet name could be one of those. Could be Kepler 19 or whatever it is. Could be any planet's name. We'll turn it into an HTML. Yes.
Well, where have we so far defined what planet name is?
We have not, right? So all we've done so far is saying this function takes some input, planet name, right? So here, when we put it as an argument to the function, remember, this is what we call an argument here, as part of the function's definition, all we're saying is it takes input. We haven't, right now, we haven't given it any input at all. But we will at some point. Okay? So now we're just defining this function that takes some input and produces some output. And like we said, after that planet name here, we need to close our. And so when we pass this in, say it's Mercury, right, whatever it might be, this, oh, I missed the var here. This HTML is going to be this, switched together with Mercury, right? Switched together with the closed H2 tag, and that becomes the H2 HTML. So what we want to return from this function is both of those things together, right? And so we'll just smush those things together, just like we smushed things together previously. They're both strings. We can just smush them together. Once again, the plus sign. Okay. So we're saying out of this function, this string that we created, smush together with this string that we created. Okay, so we're just creating one big long HTML string. And presumably later in our program, we could use that string to put actual HTML into our page. So here we're using JavaScript to generate HTML. Questions so far? This function yet. All we've done is define it. Okay, but the next step is we actually want to use this. But before that, let's create an empty array called whatever we think is appropriate that we're going to eventually use to hold HTML strings. Okay, so just create on your own. Try to create an empty array and store it in some variable. All right. Refer back to the slides if you need to. We're just going to create an empty array, so an array with nothing inside of it. And we're going to put it in some variable. So what I would do is create a planet HTML, that's what I'll call it. You can call it whatever you want, right? It's just a variable. And to create an empty array, we just do open square bracket, close square bracket. So that's an array with nothing inside. Okay, everybody get something like that? Sweet. Okay, so now that we've got this empty array, what we want to do is fill it up HTML for each planet. Okay, so we're going to use our planet array from the beginning to create elements for a new array that has the actual HTML that we'll use. Okay, we'll do this one together. So let's read the prompt here. We're going to loop through the first array, the planet array, the one that has the names. We're going to loop through that one. And each one, we're going to create some HTML, essentially using the function we just made. And we're going to put that HTML into our new array. So after this step is done, we're going to have two arrays. The first one has all of the planet's names. The second one has the HTML that we're going to use in our carousel. Okay. So each value in that array will have a whole image tag or an H2 tag. So the first one will be, image for Mercury, H2 is Mercury. The second one will be image for Venus, H2 is Venus. Okay. So let's see what that looks like. First of all, what kind of loop? Does anybody know what kind of loop we should use here when we're iterating? The most obvious loop to use. One of the two that we've learned so far. For loop. Yeah, totally. We use the for loop. And when we're using for loop to loop through an array, it'll almost always look like this. So we'll use this for keyword to start a for loop. We'll then create some variable to keep track of our index. By the way, that's why we typically use the letter I as the letter here, because it usually is representing an index in an array. So we could actually write the word index and make that our variable, but most people just shorten it and use I. You could use N or X or B or whatever, or whatever word you wanted to, obviously, because it's just another variable. But in this case, we're going to use I equals 0. And we're going to keep going through this loop. We want to keep going until I, as long as, you want to keep going as long as I is less than the length of our planets array, right? And yes.
So, quick question.
Yeah.
If you were to have multiple loops in your JavaScript, do you have to change up the name?
That's a good question. So, generally, it depends in some situations. So, for instance, if I have this loop and inside of that loop, I have another loop, in that case, I would definitely need a new variable name. If I have this loop and then right after it, I have another loop, I could reuse the same variable if I wanted to. Maybe not the best idea, but you could. Okay, so we want to keep going as long as I is less than planet's length, right? So as long as the index is less than the length, right? That means we know that that index still exists in our array, because the last index is going to be 1 minus the length. So we're going to keep going as long as I is still less than blank. And after each iteration, we're going to just increment by 1 to get the next thing in the array. So increment our index by 1 just so we can make sure you're getting the first thing at the 0 index, then the thing at the 1 index, and the 2 index, and so on and so forth until we get to the end, and I is not less than planet's length anymore. So we've done that, and then we say, we use these curly braces here, and we say, the loop code itself is in between those. So any code in there is going to run on each iteration of this loop, each repetition of the loop. Those words is kind of interchangeable. All right? So what we want to do, we want to take each name, right, to each name in this planet's array, some HTML using that name. And we want to take that HTML that we just got, we want to store it in our new array. Okay? So the first thing we'll do is we'll create a variable called, I'll just call it HTML. It's fine. Call it whatever you want, as long as it doesn't conflict with any other names. And we're going to assign that the value that results from calling our create planet HTML function. And when we call that, when we need parentheses to call a function, use its name and parentheses to call it or invoke that function to make it do something. And inside of those parentheses are planets at index I. Okay, so let's look at this. Okay, reading this, we're going to start here. Okay, start here. We're going to see. We're going to first see what this is. Okay, so planets at index I. The first time we come through here, I will be 0. Planets at 0 is Mercury. We're going to pass Mercury in as planet name to our function. So Mercury will become planet name. This function will create an image for Mercury, we'll create an H2 for Mercury, and then we'll return that HTML string, and that return will be stored in this HTML variable. Okay. So we could, to be a little more clear, we could split this out. We could start planet is equal to planets at I, and then create the HTML planet and store it in our HTML variable. Okay, so this is the same thing. I just split it into 2 lines to make it a little more clear. You know, it's really more subjective than you might imagine. So, you know, in this situation, I could look at either and make sense of it. If you can't look at the first and make sense of it, this is probably a better thing to do, right? We always opt for readability over anything else. So we want our code to be very readable. In this case, this is pretty readable, right? We're getting the I thing, whatever I happens to be, out of our planets array, storing it here. And then we're using that value to create some HTML and storing it here. And then the last time, we need to store that HTML in our new empty array. So we have this planet HTML array. And how do we put a new value? How do we put a new value into that array? Yeah, we push, right? We push it into that array, and then I'll put it in the last spot on that array. All right, so one more time. When we first run this code, I will equal 0, right? So we'll get the planet array, we'll get the thing at the 0 index, which will be, we'll store it in this planet variable. We'll then create planet HTML, passing in that planet. That will return HTML representing, you know, the HTML or an image tag and H2 tag. That will return from that function and be stored in the HTML variable. And then finally, we'll put this HTML string into our planet HTML array. And that will keep going for each planet in that array. So after this block of code runs, we'll have a new array that's the same length as the first array. But instead of having planet names, the new one can know. Any questions so far? Okay. All right, so now we've got all the HTML we're going to need for the whole carousel. Okay. So the next thing we need to do is actually make our carousel work. So similar to how we did last time, we need to create a variable that keeps track of where the carousel. Okay. So remember, the carousel is going to start at the first image, which is Mercury, and you know we're going to, if we hit next, it's going to go to the next one, and the next one, and so on. We have to keep track of where we are in that carousel. So in order to do that, we're going to go ahead and create a variable and assign it the value 0 to keep track of that. So go ahead and do that. Create a variable here to keep track of where the carousel is. I'm going to call carousel index. So you can call it whatever you like, but I like the name carousel index. It's very explicit, very descriptive of what this is. This is keeping track of where is the carousel. Remember, we're going to start it off at 0, because when we first load the page, we want it to show 0 there. I mean, we want the Mercury. We know Mercury is going to be showing, which is the first thing, or the thing at the 0 index. Okay. Our next step, and we'll just start with only doing the next, and then we'll do previous after that. So the next step here is we need to listen for when the next, and respond by running some function. Okay? So we need to listen for when the next button is clicked, when the user clicks the next button, and we need to respond by running some function. So go ahead and set that part up. You don't need to actually say what the function does, but set up that part where we listen for the click event, and we respond by running some function. So go ahead and do that part. Okay? So in order to listen for some event on some element, we know we have to set that up using jQuery. We can use jQuery to find the element that we're looking for. In this case, we just want to find the next button. Okay? The button has an ID of next, so we'll use that ID to find that button. And what we want to listen for is the click event. And when that click event happens, we're going to